In the meantime, I got a question for you. Do Republicans worship poverty, death, and disease? Oh, what a question, right? To me, it always feels like they do. But a guy who put together an article that I'm going to quote from extensively here, he documented some of the horrors that red state governors and legislators are using when they use stolen blue state tax money. And they're inflicting this torture on their own residents. And those horrors include specific policies intended to impoverish workers, to subjugate women, increase gun violence, of course, enrich local white Christian oligarchs, and make life miserable for racial and gender and religious minorities. So this is nothing new. I live in a red state. This is nothing new to you. It's certainly nothing new to me. Red states are sponges. They suck up resources, tax money from blue states. Blue states provide the money that these red states then use to fuck over everybody and anybody that they can. The question is, how did they get to this point? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. But let me give you an example of what these red states have almost across the board. They have higher rates of spousal abuse, obesity, smoking, teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases in all these Christian states, abortion, well, at least before Dobbs, now it would be forced births, bankruptcies and poverty, homicide, suicide, infant mortality, maternal mortality, forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault, dropouts from high school, divorce, contaminated air, contaminated water, opiate addiction and deaths, unskilled workers, parasitic infections, income and wealth inequality, COVID deaths, unvaccinated people, federal subsidies to states called red state welfare, people on welfare, homelessness, spousal murder, unemployment, deaths from auto wrecks, people living on disability, gun deaths. I mean, think of that list in the red states, so-called. I live in one. The rates of all that filth and horror and death and poverty and disease are the highest. And the red states are the ones run by Christian fascists who will tell you, well, the solution to all that, Malloy, you atheist bastard, is just to get prayer back in the schools. Right. But then there's a question. Are all these things... And in addition, I've got to add the widespread Christian fascist support now for foreign fascist autocrats like Vladimir Putin, and Viktor Orban, Is all this shit happening because Republicans simply hate their citizens and worship poverty, death, and disease? That's the question. Or is there something in the GOP's core beliefs and strategies that just inevitably leads to these outcomes? Well, it turns out that that's very much the case, the second one. These terrible outcomes are the direct result of policies that promote greed and racism and homophobia and anti-Semitism and all this shit that the Republican Party has been using for 40 years in order to get access to hundreds of billions of dollars from the terminally stupid that they then use, these Republican Christian fascist oligarchs then use to influence media and steal elections. And I think we fully understand at this point, God help us if we don't. I'm talking about, when I say we, in this case, I'm talking about white people. If we don't get this, racism as a political strategy always leads to massive inequality And in turn, that causes widespread poverty and pollution and illiteracy and early death, regardless, by the way, of the nation that this shit is occurring in. But I'm talking about the U.S. It's happening right now in Russia. It's happening in the Philippines. The newest president there is what, the son or grandson of Ferdinand Marcos. Oh, my God. Hungary. Orban, who is, what's his name? Used to be at Fox. How quickly we forget. Is his hero. And since the neoliberal Reagan revolution, it's been a steady trajectory for the Republicans here in America. And they're no longer Republicans. You know I call them Christian fascists because that's what they are. But here's how it happened here in America. And I'm going to quote now directly from this person's article. Okay? Here we go. The GOP first openly embraced racism in 1964 when the party's presidential candidate that year, Barry Goldwater, proudly refused to support the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it was a huge shift for the party of Lincoln. And when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law on July 2nd, 1964, the South did a collective, "What the hell?" Right. And as Lyndon Johnson told Bill Moyers, quote, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come," end quote, which turned out to be exactly the case. Thus, the newly publicly proclaimed belief in white supremacy became the official part of the Republican Party ideology in the 1960s, which led directly to Richard Nixon's explicitly racist so-called Southern strategy and Nixon's so-called war on drugs, right? And all that was later amplified by Ronald Reagan speaking about so-called states' rights at his first campaign speech near the scene of the murder of those 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi. It was also amplified by Herbert Walker Bush's Willie Horton ad campaign. Remember that? And Donald Trump's rants about Mexican rapists and telling black members of Congress to go back to where you came from. And his open denigration of immigrants from what he called shithole countries. But racism alone can't explain the entire list. There had to be something else. Indeed. The second element embraced by the Republican Party that filled out the rest of the list happened in 1980 when the party officially hooked up with religious grifters and morbidly rich executives and their dynastic families. Well, let me digress from my author's piece here. Yeah, religious grifters. I notice more and more people, writers, people who have vastly larger audience reach than I do, are finally realizing that it's this sick, twisted Christian fascism that is doing this. This is the energy that keeps it going because there's so many Americans who are just fucking scared to death that they're going to die and go to hell. Well, I know if I believe in this religion, I'll go to heaven. Oh, my God. Back to my writer. Prior to that election year, 1980, George Herbert Walker Bush and his wife Barbara were big advocates for Planned Parenthood and a woman's right to choose an abortion. Ronald Reagan, as governor of California, had signed the nation's single most liberal abortion law and was also an outspoken supporter of Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood. He was. And similarly, the white evangelical movement prior to 1980 was largely supportive of abortion rights. But they were furious when the Supreme Court banned preacher-led school prayer. And in the late 1970s, when Jimmy Carter pulled the tax exemption of segregated schools that were run by white evangelicals to get away from black folk. Jerry Falwell had started his so-called moral majority in 1978, and this uber-Christian freak, Paul Weyrich, who was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, and he's the guy who famously said, "I don't want everybody to vote," when Falwell and Weyrich signed up for the Reagan campaign. And as Don Levy writes for George Washington University's History News Network, quote, Weyrich and Falwell realized that the tax exemption issue based on racial discrimination had limited value. But opposing abortion was an issue cutting across racial and religious lines. That was their thinking on the eve of the 1980 elections, end quote. And that election year saw the first full merger of America in American history between a major political party and a religious movement, Christianity, largely run by grifters. Republicans started talking about God. In fact, that word appeared in their platform in 1980 for only the second time since the party's formation in 1856. But they started talking about God, and preachers and televangelists began to openly push Republican candidates from the pulpit in defiance of nonprofit law and the IRS. By the way, they still do, and the IRS still refuses to enforce that law. The GOP also adopted Falwell's call for return to school prayer, hostility to sex education, rejection of women's rights, assertion of patriarchy, and open hatred of homosexuality. And championing then what today we'd call the culture wars and the war on woke, Republicans fully embraced the anti-science perspective of Falwell and his colleagues, questioning for the first time the theory of evolution and scoffing at concerns about pollution causing cancer and global warming and a wide variety of diseases. And within a decade, they were even claiming, as Mike Pence wrote in an op-ed in 2000, quote, despite the hysteria from the political class and the media, smoking doesn't kill, end quote. As the GOP went deeper down their religious-fueled rabbit hole, their hostility to science was logically accompanied by a hostility to education and educated people. Herbert Walker Bush and Rush Limbaugh began talking about pointy-headed liberals in ivory towers, openly trashing higher education as a shtick to bring blue-collar voters into the party. And that was followed by a sustained Republican attack on public education itself by pushing these for-profit, privatized so-called charter schools, which was an ironic position because Republican President Dwight Eisenhower had done more to advance public education than any president in the 20th century. Thus was set up the Republican Party's 2020 hostility to masks and COVID quarantines and their attacks on vaccination and sex education. The other big turning point for the Republican Party in 1980 was Ronald Reagan's open embrace of America's oligarchs. Just 4 years earlier, in the Buckley versus Vallejo decision, the Supreme Court ruled that when a rich person showered so much money on a politician that that politician pretty much only voted the way the rich person wanted, that was no longer bribery. Oh, no. Instead, that was now First Amendment protected free speech. Free speech. And in 1978, in a decision written by Lewis Powell, the court extended that right to buy politicians to American corporations. It was extended to international billionaires and corporations in 2010 with Clarence Thomas's tie-breaking vote on Citizens United. President Jimmy Carter had championed the average person and the rights of working-class people. Carter even walked from the Capitol to the White House after his inauguration rather than take a limousine. Reagan not only brought back the limousine, he turned his inaugural balls into a lavish celebration of wealth and economic power. The Democratic Party was still at that time mostly funded by labor unions. The Republican Party, however, picked up the opportunity offered them by the Supreme Court when 2 years earlier, and they had put up a for sale sign inviting into the party any wealthy person or corporation who'd put up enough money for a Republican candidate to win an election. The result of this whole story is that red states have been turned into sacrifice zones for Reagan's racist and religious bigotry, outsourcing, and the neoliberal rise up the rich and crap on unions economic policies Reagan inflicted on America. The TV preachers have become multimillionaires with private jets. Their parishioners have slid deeper and deeper into poverty and addiction. And the unholy alliance of church and state that Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton warned us about is now arguably the second most powerful political force in America. Turns out that yesterday's rant about how red states are financing their bigotry, hate, misogyny, and low taxes on their oligarchs by essentially stealing tax dollars from blue states is just the beginning, the foundational funding of their power. While those policies also make the morbidly rich vastly richer, and those rich people and their businesses and churches return the favor by recycling part of their profit back into the pockets of Republican politicians, they also cause that whole litany of social ills that Malloy just mentioned. So now you know the rest of the story. All right, well, I added that Malloy just mentioned. But I don't think there was anything in there that you and I haven't discussed before, or that you don't know, or that I don't know. But sometimes it is a good thing to see where someone who has a wider audience, a bigger megaphone, starts talking about the same things that you and I have been talking about for 20 years. Actually, 30 years. Well, okay, 40. And it's so heartbreaking that all of these things we are aware of. We know what these son of a bitches are doing, these Christian fascists. We know what the now dead, walking still zombie Republican Party is doing to the entire country, if not the whole planet. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.